our daily lives, or a really bad sequence from, remember the movie Groundhog Day?
Did you sleep well, Mr. Connors?
Did I sleep well?
Would you like some coffee?
Yes, please. I think I'll have a double.
I hope you enjoy the festivities. There's talk of a blizzard.
Do you ever have deja vu, Mrs. Lancaster?
I don't think so, but I could check with the kitchen.
Don't we love Bill Murray? What a nightmare. I guess we all love a sense of stability in our lives, but suddenly one day hits the other and 1 year the next. Have you noticed, due to COVID-19, how we are blending things together? Was it last year or 2 years ago COVID hit? I can't remember. But there might be a solution to this, and it's quite surprising. What it is, you'll find out right now. Hey everyone, welcome to all our viewers across the world and all our Chief Executive Magazine readers. I'm Martin Lindstrom, your co-host, along with my dear friend and the world's #1 leadership coach, Marshall Goldsmith. Marshall is a member of the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame and has written some of the most iconic books out there, like What Got You Here, What Get You There, and Mojo, one of my favorites, by the way. But beside all those fancy credentials, more importantly than anything, Marshall is just an amazing human being. Hey, Marshall, welcome on the show. I know you had a little bit of a power problem right now. You up running?
Well, thank you. Thank you. So happy to be here. I'm happy I'm here at all. I'm in Nashville. I had a power outage. I'm at my daughter Kelly's house, so thank goodness she was able to patch this all together at the last second. She's a professor here at Vanderbilt, so thank you, Dr. Kelly. And I am here with my wonderful friend Martin Lindstrom, who I consider to be the world's most interesting human being. If you ever get a chance, not just read about his stuff, read about his life. He's had an amazing life. He's the author of some amazing books like Biology, Ministry of Common Sense. He was ranked one of the 100 most influential people in the entire world. And aside from that, he's also a great guy. He goes out of his way to help others, to do whatever he can to pitch in. So honored to work with you, my good friend.
Oh, thank you. You make me blush as always, right? Listen, everyone, if you have any questions or comments, just post them here or just tell us who you are and where you are. And if you like this show, by the way, don't forget to press the like or the follow or the subscribe button. Now, here's a thought experiment for you. Have you noticed how let's say a 2-hour trip going from destination A to B feels much longer than the return trip from B to A? Why is that? Well, once our brain has rendered the trip, it will literally play back the movie on the return trip, explaining why time is perceived to go faster on the return. So, is it possible to change our perception of time? Yes, by disrupting it. Now, working with Swiss International Airlines, we realized that the cabin crew felt time went slower in the air for the cabin crew up there than people on the ground. We actually discovered this because the cabin crew felt the frequency of the internal news update was less frequent than the feeling the ground staff had, despite the fact that the messages were sent out exactly at the same time. Now, the answer to this was simple: disruption, or rather transformation. The cabin crew would constantly experience a transformation, a new city, a new country, all slowing down the perception of time. Whereas the office workers would stay in exactly the same office environment day in and day out in return for kind of speeding up the perception of time. Now, this might explain why many of us over the past 2 years has felt that the days are blending together, and why we over the past year have felt the time suddenly is going faster with an ever-growing to-do list as a result, often resulting, I think, in a sense of loss of purpose. Now, does it mean that a completely random life is the answer? Well, one guy for sure can answer this. Welcome, Max Hawkins. I think the best way of introducing you is to show a clip from TEDx where you explain the first time your life became random after you realized that most of the stuff we do can indeed be predicted. Let's take a look at this video.
Decided to make an app that would help me choose where to go on this evening. And so the way that it works is that the app looks at all of the places that are on Google Maps in the city of San Francisco, and then chooses one at random. And then it calls an Uber, and that car shows up at your location and takes you to that random place. It tells the Uber driver where the random place is, but tells you nothing. And so it's a big surprise when you arrive. And so I texted Kelly, and I said we should do this. We met up and pressed the button, and suddenly, miraculously, there was an Uber driver at my apartment door. So we got in, and very quickly started heading to a part of San Francisco that neither of us really knew. It was a part of town that we just had never been in before. And when the driver told us we'd reached our destination, we thought it must have been a joke. We showed up in front of this austere brick building with a wrought iron fence in front of it and a sign that said the words, San Francisco General Hospital, Psychiatric Emergency Center.
Welcome, Max. Has anyone ever said to you, you're crazy?
I get that from time to time, yeah.
Yeah. Listen, tell me, the experiment you did in San Francisco grew, right, to become a 2-year mission. Share with me, what did you do then?
Well, I got really obsessed with the idea of randomizing my life. And increasingly, I took different parts of my life and randomized them. So I started randomizing the clothes that I wore, the food that I ate, and eventually the city that I lived in. And every time I found a new part of my life that could be randomized, I tried to write a computer program that would choose randomly for me.
You know, I love this. I love what you did. I think it's such an amazing experiment. Give me one of the really positive elements you've gotten out of randomization, and then one thing is, here's what's the problem with it.
I think that the positive thing about it is so often when we choose things based on what we think is good for us or what we think accords with our sense of who we are, that limits the set of things that it's possible to see. So you might take some whole set of options. You think that's not something that fits with me. And I think that when you randomize, because you're not going from your sense of self, it opens you up to more options. And so I think that's the positive thing, is that you can see more things. The negative thing, what I started to realize is I thought initially that randomizing would let me kind of get outside of my perceptual bubble and open me up to new experiences. But very quickly I realized that there's a lot of things in your life that are not very random, and the menu that you're choosing from inside of your life is in large part determined by what you've done before. So those were the two ends of what I was thinking about.
That's amazing. I mean, I remember you were quoted by saying that my preference has blinded me from complexity and the richness of the world. Give me a sense of how can you use randomness at work, in a work environment where we have this wheel going on and where I think a lot of people are suffering from it right now.
I think that there's so much of a focus on optimization in the workplace, and cutting costs and reducing the time that it takes to do things. But that shields you from the serendipitous things that could push your business or your work into a creative new direction. And so I think that it's actually pretty healthy for business people to add a little bit of noise into their process and allow that sort of serendipity to emerge.
Do you have an example about what that noise could be?
Let me think. I think that, for instance, if your process is if you have a very rigid process for how you do something, here's a good example. I once wrote a computer program that randomized my schedule, and so every day it would give me a schedule of what I should be doing at every moment that was completely randomly generated, and so it would have me sleeping from 3 a.m. to noon, and then working on things at different hours, and it was really difficult because it was completely different from my regular schedule, but it also opened up new ways of doing things, because if you're doing your work at 3 a.m. and there's other things going on in the world that don't usually overlap with your work schedule, and so that's kind of an extreme example, but I think that that illustrates how adding some randomness can shift your thinking.
Max, I love you for your courage. You just have to know that. Amazing. Now, listen, okay, coming up, our next guest argues that happiness as a goal is a recipe for disaster, and claims that by restricting our options, we'll be able to choose less and feel better. Marshall, listen, I couldn't think about any other guest than Barry Schwartz to build on what Max is telling us.
Barry Schwartz is an amazing, amazing guy, and so excited to have him on our show. My next book is called The Earned Life. Barry's one of, I think, 4 people I quote in the book. So Barry, you're in very unique company. I'm not sure it's good or bad, but it's definitely unique. He's an expert on the intersection between psychology and economics. He's an author of The Paradox of Choice, which is one of my favorite books. Love that book. I'm here with my daughter, Kelly, one of her favorite books. And he talked about, don't use randomness as an excuse. Part of life is random. He doesn't deny that at all. Part of it's predictable. I love what he does. In fact, I love it so much that I decided that I wear the same green shirt every day. Just cut back on a little of that choice for me. Oh, so Barry, welcome. And Barry did a TED Talk that's amazing. I think this TED Talk says it all. So let's watch the TED Talk.
Escalation of expectations. This hit me when I went to replace my jeans. I wear jeans almost all the time, and there was a time when jeans came in one flavor, and you bought them, and they fit like crap, and they were incredibly uncomfortable, and if you wore them long enough and washed them enough times, they started to feel okay. So I went to replace my jeans after years and years of wearing these old ones, and I said, I want a pair of jeans, here's my size, and the shopkeeper said, do you want slim fit, easy fit, relaxed fit? You want button fly or zipper fly? You want stone washed or acid washed? Do you want them distressed? Do you want boot cut? Do you want tapered? Blah, 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 on and on. He went, my jaw dropped, and after I recovered, I said, I want the kind that used to be the only kind. He had no idea what that was. So I spent an hour trying on all these damn jeans, and I walked out of the store, truth, with the best fitting jeans I had ever had. I did better. All this choice made it possible for me to do better. But I felt worse. Escalation.
I love that. I did better, and I felt worse. I love that. Again, a big fan. Barry, why did it fit better and you feel worse?
Well, as I told my audience, I spent 10 years trying to figure out the answer to that question and ended up writing a whole book. So here's what I think is going on. When the set of options we have is limited, our expectations about how good the option we choose will be is also limited. When there are 2 items on the menu, only a fool expects that whatever item they choose is going to be perfect. But when there are 200 items on the menu or 2,000 kinds of jeans, well, now all of a sudden, instead of expecting satisfactory, you expect perfect. And the jeans I bought were better than any I'd ever had, fit better than any I'd ever had, but they weren't perfect. And what happened was, because there were so many options, my expectations went up. And when you actually have the experience what you ask yourself pretty much is this as good as I expected it to be? And so I have sometimes said the enemy of happiness is high expectations. If your expectations are modest, you can occasionally be pleasantly surprised. If your expectations are absurdly high, it's a recipe for disappointment. And that's what happened to me when I bought jeans. And I think it's what happens to a lot of us as we face a world of essentially unlimited options.
So we basically have to manage our own expectations. I remember you actually said once that everybody needs a fishbowl, which is kind of a sharp contrast to what Max is saying, or is it?
Well, so yeah, there's a cartoon I show of a parent fish and a baby fish in a little goldfish bowl, and the caption reads, "You can be anything you want to be, no limits." And we're supposed to laugh because in this fishbowl, it's nothing but limits. But what I came to realize is that we need a fishbowl. It needs to have more in it than those poor goldfish had. But when you shatter the fishbowl so that anything is possible, most of the things that are possible are bad. We need some predictability. We need some control over our lives. And that typically requires some kind of a fishbowl. And the challenge for social scientists, psychologists in particular, is to figure out what needs to be in the human fishbowl so that people can lead rich lives, but not lives that are paralyzed with uncertainty and anxiety and disappointment.
You know, Barry, to me, one thing I've said is the great Western disease is I'll be happy when. Followed by get the money, get the status, get the BMW, blah, 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 blah. And to me, what I love about what you're saying, or one of the things I love about what you're saying, is really attacking that I'll be happy when. We have been programmed from birth by watching commercials. People like Martin, these marketing people, do this to us all the time. You know, you'll be happy when you buy the product. You'll be happy when you get the car, whatever. I love your thoughts on this. What led us into this wacky I'll be happy when nonsense anyway, and point out some strategies to get around this.
Sure. Well, this is, as I'm sure you know, a very big question. And I think there are two dimensions to it. One is that there's a kind of obsession with materialist consumption, right? We live in a consumer society. And what that means is that happiness is about the next thing we get, whatever that might be. And God forbid you're satisfied with what you have, because then you stop shopping. And so there's this whole complex set up to make sure that no matter what we have, there's something dangling in front of us that we don't yet have that'll make us happier. So I think it should be much less about what you have and much more about what you do. And it's often, there's often a trade that people make. They focus much less on what they do and much more on what they have. And that's a sucker's game. That's a game where you're basically always chasing your tail. And it is not a recipe for happiness. It's a recipe for dissatisfaction.
Now, Barry Scott Simon was one quoted on NPR saying that rules and procedures may be dumb, but they spare you from thinking. And I think both you and I have something in common, that we wrote a book. You're about wisdom, and I'm about common sense. Now, you once said, when we tap into rules, they may work in the short run, but create a downward spiral that makes them all feel worse on the long run. All reliance of rules deprives us from improvisation. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I very much admire Matt's incredible experiment. I don't think I could do it for 5 minutes, but there has to be something between rigid, rule-governed social structures on the one hand and randomness on the other. And what I argue with my collaborator in the book Practical Wisdom, and what I argued in talking about the limits of rules, is that there needs to be room for flexibility and improvisation. I think that because of the extraordinary uncertain nature of the human environment and other people, we need to be essentially to go through the world like jazz musicians. There are notes on the page and the musicians can play the notes, but what makes it jazz is not that they play the notes on the page, but how they improvise around the notes on the page. And you know, as a teacher, every time I go into a classroom, every time I interact with a particular student, the question is, does this student need tough love or kindness from me? Does this student need me to be extraordinarily detailed in my criticism, or does the student need encouragement? And, you know, I didn't know how to answer these questions when I started teaching. I've now been doing it for 50 years. And I've gotten better at reading what each student needs. And so I do a little dance with the student as I get to know the student to try to figure out what the sweet spot is so that I can be both useful, instructive, and informative, but also encouraging. And I think the same thing is true when you're raising your kids. You have your first kid and you go, oh, this is easy. Any parent who ever says that is nuts. And then your next kid comes along and you do the same thing that you did with your first kid, but lo and behold, your next kid's completely different. And everything that worked well with the first kid is a disaster with the second kid. And so you need to appreciate that there's variability, not just noise, there's systematic variability. And our job is to be able to have enough freedom and flexibility and judgment to figure out what a particular situation with a particular person calls for. I think this is the secret to having good relations with other people. I think it's the secret to having a productive team in the workplace. I think it's the secret to having a good, intimate relationship with your romantic partner. I don't know how you get through the day without wise judgment.
Fantastic. Okay, coming up, how randomness at work might be the secret source of improving employment satisfaction and with that productivity. Now, I need to ask you, Max, not everyone can live a crazy life like yours. What is your advice to the millions of people out there who feel trapped by this hamster wheel we talked about early on?
I really liked the conversation earlier about constraints and the fishbowl, and I think that one way that you can change your life is to change the constraints. You know, artists have known this for a long time, that like the work itself is actually a product of its constraints rather than just purely the vision of the artist. And so I think that if you could tweak your constraints somewhat, you could change. Limit the set of options that you have to one that's different than the one you had before. That can push you into a different direction.
You know, very interesting stuff. One of the things I think really, Max, that I've thought about when looking at what you're doing is we are being pushed toward conformity within a subgroup. So for example, if you look at online, everything is geared to, he likes this, give him that. He likes this, she likes this, give him that. And all of a sudden, everything we see is programmed to be stuff that the computer thinks we're going to like. Then pretty soon we get a very warped view of the world. So I love what you're doing just to break out of that box a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the social media companies have sort of bought onto an incorrect view of who we are, because we're not defined by our preferences or the things that we've done before. We have the ability to change and to try things that are outside of what we've liked before. And so I think part of what I'm trying to communicate is that we should think about how could we live our lives outside of this small conception of ourselves. Yeah.
Now, listen, Yuval Noah Harari, the author of *Sapiens*, talks about the life hacking and how algorithms and AI increasingly know more about ourselves than we do, right? he uses an example I remember of an algorithm detecting if a young person is gay before they even themselves know, based on eye tracking. And thus it's nearly impossible for us to take control back. Tell me, Max, can you detach yourself from AI at all? Can you leave the grid as you've done, or is it just an artist do an experiment because you have an extraordinary will? Give me a sense of this, because it's just such an amazing thing you've done, but it just seems so unreal somehow.
I think that it's important to understand the way that these algorithms work. And one nice thing about randomizing is that it's sort of like putting up a mirror to an algorithm, in that you can see the algorithm trying to match to this random stimulus that you've given it. And I think that once you see the way that the algorithm works and the way that it's trying to put you into a box, then it kind of breaks the spell. Because essentially it's like a magic trick where if you know the secret behind it, it doesn't have as much power. So that's why I encourage people to try adding some random noise into whatever they're feeding into the algorithm, and then see how that changes their feed.
Fantastic. Well, coming up, we asked one of our time's probably most respected business author to challenge the M&M panel. And oh my, this is a tricky question. So stay with me, because we asked Daniel Goleman to challenge Max and Barry. For those of you who doesn't know Daniel, he's the author and probably one of the most iconic business books out there, The Emotional Intelligence, which, by the way, I think is written 26 years ago, a book which was featured on the New York Times bestseller as #1, and later on stayed on the list for 1.5 years with more than 5 million copies sold. Now, Daniel Goleman will, by the way, be joining us on the M&M Show this fall, but let's just run the BCG minute for a moment here.
Here's my question. Let's say you really care about the environmental impacts of how you live, what you buy, what you do. Do you really believe that we have enough information, that we have transparency about those impacts to make the right choice? I don't think so.
Barry, I have a feeling of this one is straight down your alley somehow.
Well, let me just say I completely agree with Daniel Goleman. My wife and I moved to California about 5 years ago, and in California they have many propositions on the ballot. You're not just voting for candidates; you're voting for propositions. And so we were going to be conscientious voters. We spent more time researching these propositions. We spent more time filling out this ballot than we had all of the previous 50 elections we had voted in our lives. And I assure you, we were far from confident in the choices that we made. They're all complicated. There are interest groups who are trying to spin the propositions to serve whatever their interests are. It was a nightmare. And I feel the same way about environmental issues. I have no doubt that human-caused global warming is real and that we face catastrophe. And even if we stopped it tomorrow, life's going to be a lot worse for us than it previously was. I have no doubt that that's true. But when you ask me, well, what should you do, you Barry, to solve this problem? I throw up my hands. I don't know. There's an enormous amount of expertise out there. I can't educate myself. I have to depend on the good judgment and expertise of other people. And then the question is, which other people? So I think Goleman's completely right. In the complex world we live in, nobody knows enough barely to even walk across the street, let alone solve any reasonably complex problem. We make choices, hopefully with some information that we can trust, but it's always going to be partial. The sources are always going to be only partly reliable. And so to some degree, it's a crapshoot. So he's right. We need people we can trust.
So here we go, Barry. I actually thought we would have a conflict on air, and you're just in pure harmony. Listen, I want to say thank you so much for joining us on the M&M Show. And Max, thank you as well. I couldn't find two more different people, yet similar people somehow. Listen, Marshall, I just have to ask you in reflection, what are you taking away from this conversation?
I think I'm taking away two dimensions. The first is the Barry dimension. That is limit choice that doesn't help. Limit noise that doesn't help. And a corporation limit that, on the other hand, don't, back to the Max's point, don't put yourself in a box. And be willing to do experiments, be willing to go outside that box and try new things, because if we're not careful, we can let artificial intelligence put us in a box that we almost never get out of. So those are my two reflections.
Yeah, I so agree with you. And I have to say one thing, that is, I love the idea about putting some randomness at work. I'm not sure I agree with Max about waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning and go to work, right? But I certainly do agree about the idea of sprinkling randomness into what you do rather than being hit by this routine. Now, I guess it's time for a mule summary. So I guess I have to bring out my iPad here and just summarize what I've learned. And I think Winston Churchill once said, I wanted to write a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. Well, that's really the summary of this whole conversation. I think it's super complex. So here's one thing I'll take out of it. Here's what I'm learning. Routine dominates. And I think it dominates more and more in our world. So I'll put in routine on the screen here. And I'll say, if you add that together with disappearance of randomness, which is really the opposite of what Max is saying, well, then I think that equals losing track of time and also purpose. Now, this is a home-created model. I'm sure a lot of people disagree, but I do think in the end of the day, we need more randomness at work. We need to disrupt ourselves. We need to have more transformation. And that, I will actually believe, is generating kind of the opposite of common sense, which I call nonsense, because common sense is fading away the less you see things from other points of view. I tend to say that the more you see the same thing from multiple points of view, the more you actually feel a sense of common sense. And that's what Barry talked about with wisdom, because I would claim that wisdom and common sense is kind of the same. Wow, that was 1 minute of mule summary here. Now, next week, we will be joined by the God. Thank you, Marshall. I was a bit nervous on this one, I have to say. Next week, we'll be joined. Thank you. We'll be joined by, I would say, Marshall, I think you agree with me, the godfather of management, Tom Peters. And then we'll also be joined by the #1 Amazon author in business. Her name is Susan David. She wrote the Emotional Agility. Let's just take a look at this video in case you've just forgotten about Tom and his personality.
Every meeting that does not stir the imagination and curiosity of attendees and increase bonding and cooperation and engagement and sense of worth and motivate rapid action and enhance enthusiasm is a PLO, permanently lost opportunity.
PLO, Marshall, the icon is back. Tom Peters, even with a new book.
Look, poor Susan David. Good luck on getting a word in edgewise.
Yeah, me too. Here we will have the conflict on air. Anyway, thank you, Marshall. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Thanks, of course, to Barry and Max. See you next, not Tuesday, but next Thursday, the 16th of September. Bye for now.